Morning, everybody. We will get started right on time here today. Just wanted to quickly introduce those who will be participating in today's presentation. Myself, Peter Cleary, principal here at Santis Health. I've worked federally and provincially in healthcare and have been with Santis for a number of years now. Stephanie Gower, who heads up our government relations activities. She has an extensive experience in consulting as well as working for federal members of parliament. And Ian Chesney, who is in Ottawa with me, senior consultant, has a lot of experience working in healthcare, most recently at the provincial level last mandate. Who we are, I don't think I really need to say too much here because I believe lots on this webinar will know who we are, but we're Santis Health. We are a health and life sciences focused consultancy where we provide strategic advice, public policy, communication support, marketing, and public affairs support to a range of health related clients. Today, we are going to run through the current environment, try and unpackage what has happened over the last couple of weeks. We are in a very strange place now than we were let's say a year ago. We'll overlay that environment with how we see the political context, especially with a new and robust federal conservative leader. And then from there, we'll walk through what happens next. What can you expect in the next month? Will there be a confidence vote? Will there be an election? We will try and give you our best take, especially when it comes to what will the health agenda be federally and the FPD dynamics that impact that federal health agenda. So with that, I believe our colleague Ian will take us through the current environment. So Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. So just going to start by looking back over the last 8 months and how we've gotten to the place we're in, particularly with the pandemic. So obviously the most of this year so far has been dominated by COVID-19, and at the federal level has been dominated by the Fed's emergency relief efforts that have been really the sole focus of their agenda for certain time. So all those mandate commitments that they brought forward in December, remember those mandate letters, basically no progress on any of that. It's all been about COVID relief all the time. More recently in the summer, we've seen a scandal emerge, another ethics scandal, and there's been a lot of efforts trying to kind of weather that and change the channel. And so that's really distracted from the government's efforts with respect to COVID and efforts to try to look forward and change the channel and potentially bring forward a new mandate, which I'll get to. And of course, there's been, as Peter said, a lot of speculation about a fall federal election. And you know, the likelihood of this is questionable, but that has still been brewing out there. So really the first 8 months have been kind of dominated by this really unpredictable and volatile situation at the federal level. So what is prorogation? So obviously, as everyone's seen, Parliament has been prorogued. I mean, at a formal procedural level, prorogation is simply the Prime Minister seeking the support of the Governor General to essentially bring an end to a parliamentary session. You need to do this in order to reset your agenda and bring forward a new mandate. From that perspective, none of this is really out of the norm for governments. Previous governments have prorogued all the time. It's really a normal procedure. It's really about how it's done and the timing and the context that it's done in that brings forward potentially some criticism, which we'll get to in a second. But procedurally, it means all legislation dies that the government had been putting forward or working on. All committee activity dies. So those studies that were looking into the WE scandal, any other committee studies that were ongoing have all been put to an end. And what the Liberals have announced is basically their goal to bring forward a new speech from the throne on September 23rd, and have sort of been starting to signal that this will have a major social welfare agenda or component to it as part of their sort of post-COVID recovery phase. And so some of the things we've heard about that are potentially childcare, and a lot of pieces directly related to healthcare as well, including pharmacare, and potentially even some early steps towards universal basic income. And so why prorogation? So, I mean, there's been a lot of talk in the media about, again, as I said, the timing and the context of using this as a tool, and some criticism that's been brought forward with that. Of course, with respect to the Liberal government, it is politically motivated. I mean, you know, from a really crass political standpoint, it's an opportunity to change the channel and to get the media focused, hopefully, off of the drip that continues, particularly when you have opposition-led probes through committees. And as I said before, of course, those committees have been put to an end for the time being. But from the government's perspective, I mean, you know, they do have some validity in saying that their previous mandate that they issued in December of last year really no longer matches the realities that Canadians find themselves in. And of course, the last few months have been solely dominated by COVID, and there is an opportunity and in some respects a need to bring forward a new agenda, particularly if they are proposing sort of major social welfare changes that from their standpoint require, in a minority government, of course, support from the other parties. And so that's really going to be the next step here is sort of, I think for us, watching what sort of social welfare package is proposed through the speech from the throne, and how the Liberals navigate support from the opposition. And it's quite possible that this could be such a major social welfare package that it will sort of force the NDP into a supporting position. You've already seen some of the other parties kind of try to get their hand in early on to say that they won't support the new mandate of the federal government. You know, I think that's less about them desiring an election and more wanting to put their stake in the ground early so they don't feel that they have to prop up the government. But so right now it's seeming unlikely that an election will happen, particularly if the Liberals can get the support from the NDP, which is quite possible they could, in order to move forward with their confidence vote. But of course, it's really up to the Canadian public at a certain point to judge if prorogation was an appropriate tool, and that does play into our attitudes, the public's attitudes towards the federal government as well, which I'll get to now.
I might just add on prorogation. I'm on this tangent right now about how, you know, when a government does something that's politically motivated, well, everything a government does is politically motivated. It's our system of government. The Liberals are elected to be a partisan leader of government. They represent everybody, but everything they do is obviously going to be based in politics, as has every other time in recent memory that prorogation has been used. Jean Chrétien used prorogation to clear the decks before Parliament and became Prime Minister to prevent an Auditor General's report from seeing the light of day at that particular time. Stephen Harper used prorogation to calm the mood of the political environment, which prevented a confidence vote from not being able to be brought forward, and his government toppled. Dalton McGuinty used prorogation twice, once to essentially do a reset a year out before an election. He prorogued for 4 days so he could bring forward a throne speech, and he prorogued again to shut down the debate on gas plants when he resigned as leader. So prorogation is something that is often used. It's used as a tool to reset, calm, and try and bring focus to a government. And I would also say that it gets pretty messy after you have several years of a parliamentary session in terms of the number of bills and motions on the order paper. So it's quite tragic for a lot of private members that are working hard to bring forward a bill and it's stopped in their tracks. But if you ever have a little bit of nerd time like we tend to do, go on and see the hundreds and hundreds of motions and bills that kind of get on there and collect, and the end of a parliamentary session allows an opportunity to do a bit of a spring cleaning, which happens during elections regardless anyway. But I think it's whether or not the public will accept the fact that the Liberals were able to shut down committee work at a time during COVID when they specifically made committees to gave committees the ability to operate throughout the summer in a manner they often don't, if it's acceptable for them to do that. And that's where the judgment will fall onto the Liberals. Sorry, Ian.
No problem. So what do the polls tell us? So Abacus data has some really good polling data out that that's been updated quite recently as of the last few days, that really captures, you know, how the parties have sort of navigated their public support since the 2019 election, and particularly highlighting how the federal Liberals have experienced some spikes in support when they were really in the thick of weathering that kind of first phase of COVID-19, that period from about March to about May or June of this year. But also we've seen, you know, and that's pretty common for governing parties and leaders across the country during times of crises, from a political science standpoint, to experience sort of spikes in support. More recently, that has started to drop off, I think, as sort of the dog days of the pandemic have gone on. People are starting to get a bit more of pandemic fatigue, hearing about it and talking about it constantly. And also for the government, they've experienced an ethics scandal, and that has rocked their public support a bit. So, you know, early on, or back a few months ago, there was lots of talk about the governing Liberals really seizing the moment and taking advantage of their support, particularly in the absence of a new Conservative leader, and trying to go back to the polls. That is now brought into a little bit of question, because really, arguably, you would theoretically want to do that if you could seek a majority, and it doesn't look like public support, at least at this time, is pointing in that direction. From a regional standpoint, the Liberals still carry lots of support in key provinces of the country, including Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and British Columbia. They still have continued to not recover from last year in terms of their where they've lost support, particularly in Alberta and the prairies. Some of that may be sort of the festering of the Western separatism that has gone on for some time now. But they have more or less managed to at least hold on to their minority level support in some of the other key provinces. But again, this doesn't really point enough towards a majority, at least not right now, from my perspective, for the government to try to kind of capitalize that and seize that and really want to go to an election. So, you know, with all the talk about proroguing, as we discussed, and a speech from the throne, and sort of trying to force the hand of the other parties, and potentially within that, is there really a desire there to go back to the polls and seek another election? I mean, it's possible, but I think this is really more about using an opportunity where they know they can force some support from key parties, particularly the NDP, because I don't think the polling, or at least at a public support level, is really pointing strongly for an advantage to going to an election to ultimately try to seek a majority government.
I might actually just say, before we switch to this next section, you can ask questions in this beautiful little Zoom webinar system. There's a Q&A button that you can click there and drop your questions in there. We will get to as many questions as we can, and we have built in time to be able to get to them. So feel free to ask questions as you have them, and we will address them. And I should also add that we will be sending out a survey following the webinar to get your feedback on if it worked for you, and if you wish to have heard something else or something different, and we will want to take that into account. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steph.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm sure as many of you are watching, after a very lengthy and rather odd leadership campaign, the Conservatives elected MP Erin O'Toole from Durham as their new leader. This is the first Conservative Party of Canada leader that's not from Western Canada. O'Toole was in Prime Minister Harper's cabinet as Veterans Affairs Minister in 2015, first elected in 2012. O'Toole won with 57% of the vote on a third ballot, beating out Peter MacKay, who was seen as the front runner throughout the entire campaign. So very interesting result after a very long night of watching this leadership campaign unfold. O'Toole also picked up massive support from formidable first-time candidate and social conservative Leslyn Lewis, who Dr. Lewis has also publicly declared her intention to run for the Conservatives in the next election. So just briefly touching on sort of the key players now, we've seen a lot change over the last week and a half for O'Toole, and he's made some significant changes to caucus leadership, shadow cabinet roles. And so we've seen the appointment of Candice Bergen, MP from Manitoba, as the deputy leader, and shadow cabinet roles, MP Michelle Rempel-Garner taking on the health critic role from MP Matt Genereux. This is a really interesting role for Michelle Rempel, a very vocal advocate for Western Canada and also women's rights, LGBTQ rights in the party, and a massive social media following. Michelle Rempel is known by Conservatives across the country. So very vocal MP taking on the role of health. MP Pierre Poilievre stays in the finance role. James Cumming in innovation, science and industry. And MP Rosemary Falk, who originally supported Dr. Leslyn Lewis, taking on the seniors portfolio. In terms of the key staff and at the party and in the leader's office, O'Toole's bringing in Fred Delory as his national campaign manager. Fred has managed several campaigns, including the last two leaderships of Christine Elliott in Ontario. He also ran himself in Nova Scotia and was a former director at the party level. Janet Friday-Dory, also hailing from the East Coast, will become the executive director of the Conservative Party of Canada. And Tasha Michaud is the leader's new chief of staff, who has worked for the leader since, I believe, 2013 in his MP's office. So what's next for the Conservatives? And as I sort of outlined here, I think the stars have aligned for O'Toole and the Conservatives should we be facing an election sometime this year or next year. These were the largest membership numbers in Canadian political and any Canadian political party's history. So 269,000 Canadians signed up, paid $15 to vote in the last leadership. I would also really highlight the fact that the Conservatives, although we've had the highest fundraising numbers in the last quarter, we've been consistently raising more funds than any party over the last 10 years. And I'm aware that the Conservatives, after the last election in 2019, actually had enough in the coffers to run another full election. So they're really ready to go in terms of fundraising, and I think we'll see all the resources going into expansion of seats if there is another election. What's interesting as well is obviously O'Toole can utilize the investigations and ethics violations that are tarnishing the Liberals now. But I was listening to him this morning, walking into his first caucus meeting as the new leader, and he's using some language we haven't heard from the Conservatives before. He said we'll see a Conservative Party that is engaged, ethical, and compassionate. So it's a little bit different for the Conservatives, positioning himself as fiscally responsible, but also as that ethically sound choice for Canadians, should we see a fall election. Just one other point to make is that throughout all of this, we haven't heard much from the NDP, and it has been a fairly weak display from them throughout COVID and following the Conservative leadership. So we'll have to watch them carefully and see sort of if things change for the NDP over the coming weeks. What's really interesting to note, and my colleague spoke about this before, in terms of the prorogation, is that the Liberals have really done an excellent job at sort of spinning this, that this is about resetting government priorities and reassessing the fiscal picture, when really it does shut down every ethics committee investigation that's going on. We understand that the Prime Minister is using this opportunity to really solidify caucus relationships and ensuring there is really no dissension among the ranks prior to their retreat, but also prior to resuming Parliament on the 23rd. It's really interesting to note that out of sort of all of star cabinet ministers that Trudeau began with in 2015, I think Freeland is the only cabinet minister to remain out of that sort of star cabinet lineup. So it's really going to be an opportunity for him to promote from the backbenches, but also ensure that the caucus relationships are really solid between his office and all of the Liberal MPs.
Steph, we had a question come in that you might actually be able to answer while you're talking about this. Do you think there's any reason Peter MacKay didn't get elected? Do you have any thoughts on the MacKay-O'Toole leadership itself and how O'Toole came to win the leadership?
I really think that it came down to who worked harder to pull the vote and their get out the vote strategy. I think that MacKay made some early missteps in the campaign right away. And it was such a long, sort of almost painful campaign just because of COVID and turning everything to online and the emails, hundreds and hundreds of emails a day going out to party memberships. So you had to be really careful with those tactics. But in terms of a mail-in ballot and ensuring you collect all your supporters' ballots, I just know that O'Toole's team was much more organized and really focused on that, which in the long run made the difference. Shoring up that support from Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan, as much as I don't think he'd want to admit, really makes a difference as well.
Thanks for that. So what happens next? Thanks for folks that voted in the poll. 56% of you voted, which I guess is on par for how many of us vote in elections. And it looks like most of you think it's going to happen later in 2021. A small number of folks think this fall, quite a few in the spring, but the majority in later 2021 or beyond. If there's any interesting polls you think we should ask the group, just message in the Q&A and we can set it up. But for now, what can we expect? So right now, there's a couple things happening. You have the premiers of Quebec and Ontario meeting. It's likely there'll be some sort of statement or pronouncement coming out of that. You have the Prime Minister doing a lot of caucus engagement, his regional caucuses, his full caucus, cabinet retreat next week. And all of this is leading up to the throne speech, which will take place on September 23rd. And we're getting the sense that the throne speech is being written in a engaging manner with cabinet ministers and individuals. Not to say that it necessarily wasn't done before, but I think there's an emphasis that it's being done in a collaborative way, especially as you're a second mandate prime minister who's in the thick of it and wants to make sure you're bringing together your caucus in good support of the government. Let's just remember the throne speech is a high level of count of what they will plan on doing in the upcoming parliamentary session. Don't expect specific program or specific funding commitments baked into a throne speech. There would be, lines that give high level affirmation of what they want to work on, but to get into the details of things, that will come in the form of mandate letters and more specifically a budget. So as you're thinking about how you want to engage with government folks on what should be in the throne speech, just make sure you're writing it in a way that you could see it as being written in a throne speech. So feel free to go back to throne speeches in the past, get a sense for the high level nature that they are written, and then I would think about how you would frame your priorities in a manner that could be broadly portrayed to Parliament as a priority for the upcoming session. After the throne speech, that will trigger a bunch of different things. And the only caveat I'll give here is that the power of being in government is that you are able to choose when things happen. You have the ability to bring forward, government has the ability to bring forward votes and legislation, or offer up an opposition day, which the opposition can put forward a confidence motion if they wish. But that agenda setting is up to the government. One of the first things I think they'll have to do, and by I mean myself and the team at Santis think that they will have to do, is address the fact that when they prorogued, they also announced what they're going to do after CERB ends, which is September 27th, I believe. And they need to have a new system in place, which they want to change EI and have a new recovery benefit in place, which means somehow between the 23rd and the 27th of September, they will need new spending authority and new powers to be able to put forward this program. And I should also add that the government had spending authority delivered to them by Parliament that expires on September 30th as well too. So at the end of the September, the government will need spending authority for programs like this, for broad-based government spending, COVID-related or not. Their kind of free reign or unfettered spending ends September 30th. So the first confidence vote doesn't necessarily have to be on the throne speech. After the throne speech is delivered, the government can call forward another piece of legislation, or they can call the throne speech forward for debate. So whether or not the government has a first confidence vote on the throne speech or something else, we don't know. I don't think the government would fall on either a throne speech or on a scoped piece of legislation to provide support for Canadians because of COVID. I think the government, if they are going to fall, would fall on a much bigger spending plan, which would basically be a budget that we know is in the works, especially because they have no spending authority beyond September 30th. After the throne speech, we can expect mandate letters. And I'll go through a little bit of this in a second, but mandate letters have been released a couple different times since 2015, either at the beginning of a mandate or when a new minister takes a post. So this would be I believe this might be the first time, if not the second, where broad-based mandate letters would be given. They never said that they would do this. This is us speculating that they would do this. And there's also like minor speculation that a cabinet shuffle could still happen as well too. I would just say that speculation is fun to talk about, but it's, the only people that know whether or not these things will happen are the Prime Minister, their Chief of Staff, and one or two other advisors. So everybody, myself included, speculating about it. It's just that we're just giving you our informed opinion. And on mandate letters, it is likely that they would have to give ministers a new set of agenda items, given the fact that so much has changed since COVID, and given the fact that the whole reason for proroguing was to set the government on a new path with the context of COVID and the health crisis that we have seen. So what are some of the things that we could expect is on the health agenda? So previous commitments: pharmacare, drug reform, national formulary, lowering the cost of drugs. Those have all been in mandate letters since 2015. Arguably, the government probably has some work to do there. I mean, they've put funding for a Canada Drug Agency. They have made some strides on PMPRB, as well as had some fairly difficult conversations around that as well too, and continue to have difficult conversations around proceeding with that regulatory package. You have the fact that they said they'd have a health accord in 2015, which had a 5-year period that would be renegotiated. So that's in 21-22 coming up. Canada Health Act reform was in the last mandate letter, and kind of getting to one of the questions that I see in the Q&A, whether or not long-term care will work its way into that is something that would be interesting to see. The Prime Minister said twice that he's interested in it in one of his daily Q&As. Other things that were on previous mandate letters, antimicrobial resistance, other public health issues like vaping, marketing to kids, front of package labeling, and opioid misuse. They will either have to answer for why these things are no longer a priority, or they will have to affirm that they are a priority in the next mandate letter. And some of the other things that have come to light because of COVID that we are watching are around long-term care, home care, and national standards that the NDP has been calling for. It will be curious to see how the government uses their relationship with PTs and their funding relationship, how prescriptive they want to try and be on those things. And it would be very interesting if they want to take it to the next level, which I think the NDP would support, to try and bake some of these things in legislation. Primary care modernization is a hot topic, especially because Canada Health Infoway is doing a lot of work and received a lot of money during COVID to support provinces in their virtual care mandates. And that is aligned with the health technology innovation as well too. Public health modernization is something that we have talked about passively because of the pandemic, but arguably public health has had a deficit of funding by all governments in the last 20 years. And taking a look at the SARS report will kind of leave us some lessons rather that we didn't really learn at that time. And mental health and cannabis 2.0 are two things that will likely have to come back to the government's agenda. This is a lot for a mandate letter. And the last mandate letter, they had a lot, and you can see how much they got done. So it will be curious to see if this is a government trying to show that they can get a whole bunch done in minority government, or they want to lay out their priorities in case they go to an election. And I should actually end, before I go on, just on pharmacare, because I know that's an interest for a lot of people. My take on this is that if the government truly wants to move forward with pharmacare, they need to give it a level of priority that they haven't yet. When Bill Blair was made in charge of legalizing cannabis, he was a parliamentary secretary, but they put a point person on that and they said, you need to get this done. Because if you have a minister who's responsible for COVID and all the rest that goes with the Health Canada portfolio now, arguably the most important issue for Canadians today, I find it hard to believe that a minister can do all that and bring forward a massive complex program like pharmacare is, working with provinces and territories in the way that they have to do. So unless government starts being more prescriptive about how they plan to get it done, I would imagine it's going to be a slow burning issue. And there's another question, which is, well, would they put forward a bigger spending plan that would speak to Canadians or the NDP in a way that pharmacare doesn't? So if they move forward with universal basic income, is that a big enough file to basically say that's what we're choosing to do right now because it's more important, which kind of puts pharmacare on the back burner? I will be curious to see how the government handles that.
Peter, I would just also add, to address a few of the other questions in the Q&A, that I think the opioid crisis, you touched on it briefly, but I do think that's going to be a priority for the government. The crisis has been exacerbated by COVID, and I think it will continue, and the relationship with the provinces is going to be very important in handling this. So far, it's been a lot of I would say media attention, but not a lot of government intervention on it. So it'll be really interesting to see if they have any commitments in the throne speech regarding that.
And I'm just checking out the questions to see if we missed anything, and if we did miss anything, just to ask us, because we still have time and a few more slides on the budget. The one thing that I would frame up for you on the budget as you're thinking about what activities you need to do. The budget process starts months before the public realizes it starts. The process within government is that the departmental bureaucrats, the civil service, writes up their spending plan, their own budget submission for Finance Canada. That budget submission from each department is approved and reviewed and approved by the minister in charge of that department. So let's use Health Canada. Health Canada will put together a spending plan. It's internal. It doesn't go public. That is approved by the minister and sent into Finance Canada for approval. So that requires work by the civil service in Health Canada. It also requires review and approval by the political office and the minister. If you're going to get something in the budget, it is most often that ask needs to be baked into that departmental plan before it goes into finance. I would say the vast majority of things that are in the budget are things that are included in that departmental spending plan earlier on. That's not to say that finance or prime minister's office doesn't put in things after the fact. It's not to say that the political office may push for something to finance that could be included after that spending plan is done. I think the point I want to impart here is that, regardless of when the public consultation process takes place, the work on the budget starts a lot earlier, which means our work starts now, if not yesterday, in making sure we are engaging individuals in government on what you believe needs to be done, especially as it relates to COVID. I would expect that the government will have some sort of truncated online consultation process or teletown halls or a series of stakeholder engagements. I've already seen Minister Freeland out there doing that. But I would make sure you're turning your mind to having something ready for when that online piece takes place, and noting that the time to engage is now. I wouldn't wait. There's no reason why you should wait. So key takeaways and a lot of questions. So I'll run through these, and then Ian and Steph, why don't you kind of chime in on your take as well too, and then we can tackle some of the questions that have come in. So I think you've heard from us. We don't think that there will be a fall election, and based on what we've heard from you, we don't think that you think that either. The only thing we'd say here is that anything could change. Who knows? There could be there could be a development in the WE scandal next week that just blows this whole thing open, or there could be a mess up like what happened with Joe Clark, and we could find ourselves going to the polls. It could happen. It's a minority government. But in that context of minority government, the WE charity scandal isn't gone. Steph flagged for Ian and I yesterday that a budsman is looking into a bunch of procurement contracts that the government did with the WE charity. Committees will start back up. All of those things will rear their head again. And all of this is going to be happening in the context of the government trying to move forward on a budget. And this is where the government will be wanting to talk to you, to provincial governments, to parliamentarians on what they should be working on. They'll be pushing to have those futuristic conversations while trying to manage anything that they would hope it's in the background of the WE charity, but that may or may not happen. And all of this will be done at the same time trying to get the support from the NDP because the Bloc and the Conservatives essentially have said, not it, we're not going to prop them up. That means that it's on to the NDP, which I would be curious on others' take, but I think the NDP would happily play that role to get some of their initiatives funded, because if there's a minority government and at the levels that they are, they're not going to have that power in any other way other than a minority government. And the government will also need to be thinking about what their premiers want as well too. The relationships with premiers have been pretty good because the federal government has been giving money. Premiers are starting to engage a lot more now. We're seeing that today. We've heard that there will be more engagement by premiers in the future. That's no surprise. The question is, will the federal government try and be more prescriptive with how the funding they're giving needs to be spent, or will the premiers decide to become more aggressive? I would argue the closer you start feeling there's an election, the more aggressive premiers will get. And the last point that our team here, we kind of were thinking, if there's anybody here who's tried to access the healthcare system right now, it's not easy. It's not easy because there's a lot of COVID protocols in place by necessity. But we've already seen some reports come out from Kai, High, and others that people are actually avoiding going to get access to healthcare, and that there's a risk for heart attacks and strokes and the rest. There's a backlog of elective surgeries that haven't been done. There's a very real issue. There's vaccines that haven't been accessed because the vaccine programs haven't been able to operate in a normal way. there's a very real a prospect that COVID will carry on, and you're going to have this greater health issue emerge of Canadians not accessing healthcare in a manner they should, because we've had to change due to COVID, and we need to constantly change more so that we keep access open so that Canadians can stay healthy. So that's our 6 takeaways. I'm going to pause and let Ian and Steph chime in here.
I'll just jump in for one thing that I think from a healthcare perspective, folks should be looking out for. And this is kind of, I've been watching the questions, and folks have been asking about specific sectors like long-term care, like pharmacare, and kind of specific programs and sectors that the federal government has either kind of hinted at getting involved in the past, or sort of kind of gone all the way in the last few months in providing funding, particularly really in the context of COVID. I do think it will be important to watch all that as it unfolds, because of the how precedent setting that is from a jurisdictional standpoint. I mean, as everyone knows, the challenge with healthcare has always been jurisdictional between the provinces and the federal government, provinces and territories and the federal government. You know, COVID presents the federal government with an opportunity to get a bit more involved in this sector than any federal government has in the past. And that will, if you kind of add all those programs up, whether it's it's how far they stick their hand in with respect to long-term care or pharmacare or anything of that nature, that all together really changes the FPT dynamic. And so, it will be interesting to see how they navigate that, because of course, on the one hand, there's been a temptation throughout COVID from the federal government to, respect PT jurisdiction and not get involved in that too much, and play more of a kind of a fiscal support role, which is really the traditional role of the federal government in that sphere. But on the other hand, there's also a number of issues have arisen throughout the pandemic that has, begged a lot of questions in terms of greater federal involvement. So I think watching that and how precedent setting that becomes in terms of jurisdiction in healthcare will be hugely important going forward in terms of how future federal governments work with PTs in health.
Steph, I think you were trying to get in.
Yeah, no, the only other point I would add sort of to number 3 is now is the time to engage with the opposition as well. And it's an opportunity with a new conservative leader to introduce your organization if you're at the national scale or even provincially. Send a congratulatory letter to the new leader and potentially the new health critic. And introduce your organization and start influencing their thinking on your particular file. I failed to mention earlier that Erin O'Toole was actually the only conservative leadership candidate with any sort of health platform. So the thinking is there, especially around long-term care. So if you're looking to have that conversation with his office, please reach out. I'd be happy to assist you with that. But I think now is a really important time to engage with the opposition.
I should add on, Ian, you were talking about the dynamic that the federal government has on health right now provincially, and there's a couple questions that have come in on national standards for policy issues that impact health charities work. I would just say on the point of national standards themselves, the federal government can make national standards. Whether or not they're enforceable or have any teeth is kind of the question. On long-term care, the NDP want national standards that provinces buy into. If we look to the Health Accord on home and community care, there was a set of shared principles that provinces bought into. I would imagine that if there were to be any set of standards, it's usually going to have to be tied with funding that the federal government is giving the provinces, and the provinces would then voluntarily sign on to spending that funding based on a couple priorities. I think anytime the federal government has tried to be overly prescriptive, that doesn't work on a voluntary standpoint because provinces, why would they? And Quebec obviously will opt out. The only way the feds can really bring down anything that has any teeth is opening up the Canada Health Act or bringing in a new piece of legislation that the provinces would view as draconian. So I think it would come down to what sort of relationship the Prime Minister and this government wants to have with provinces. And if if it works in their favor to have a fight with provinces, and then if it works for the particular point of view that you bring forward, that you're comfortable with that fight taking place as long as you're on the sidelines. So that's a little bit of background how those standards could be set either from a voluntary or a non-voluntary point of view. We'll try and get through a couple more of these questions. Some of these questions, I don't know if we're going to be able to respond. It would be curious to see how many people would think that would win the next election. We can get that. I think we'll have to save that poll because we're almost out of time now. On any word on plans to clear refugee immigration backlog caused by the pandemic, I don't have anything specific to answer that. I would lean to my colleagues if they have anything. I would imagine that we will have to find out in the throne speech mandate letters if that is indeed a priority for the government. I think that's the answer to a lot of very policy specific things, which is, are they going to do something about it? We will know in the next 2 weeks, I would imagine. On the question of pharmacare, how they split Indigenous and Crown Indigenous relations, and would they replicate that within Health Canada? Interestingly about Health Canada, there's been a lot of reports, there were a number of reports over the last 2 decades that actually called for Health Canada to be all but disbanded because it's a regulatory body where you can have some of their branches just kind of put out to arm's length regulatory agencies, and public health could be its own. That never actually came to fruition. I actually think, I might be wrong, but I actually think that was a set of recommendations under the Chrétien government that were never enacted. But there's always been that debate, which is, does Health Canada need to stay the way it is? And the political question now, in terms of getting stuff done, do they need to parse out public health? They possibly could. And then you might ask yourself, should they parse out pharmacare as well too? How many ministers of health could you have? The answer is many, depending what the government's priorities are. But this also speaks to parliamentary secretaries probably not being appropriately used either. Bill Blair was a parliamentary secretary when I got cannabis done, and I'd say he's one of the few really good individuals that were given the flexibility to use that role productively rather than just being a talking head supporting a minister. Not to be offensive to parliamentary secretaries, but it's a tough role to actually be able to get some authority to do work when you believe you need to do something. And then the last question here that I think we can probably answer is around housing investments. I don't know. Adam Vaughan is somebody who has been parliamentary secretary. He was, at least for housing, for some time, and he was really pushing that agenda coming from Toronto. And I would imagine folks like him and Nathaniel Erskine-Smith and others in the GTA are constantly pounding the pavement in caucus and in cabinet that that's something that needs to be done. So I don't think the issue has gone away. We will see how their efforts are, given that is an issue for Toronto as well as many other areas of Canada in the upcoming throne speech. With that, Ian and Steph, do you have any other thoughts to any other final questions or key takeaways? And then we'll wrap up if no other questions come in. With that, then, thank you everybody for joining us. We'll share a survey around afterwards, and we would be pleased to hear your thoughts, and we look forward to seeing you next time.